On the line with us is Professor Juan Cole. He is the Richard P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History at the University of Michigan, the author of his newest book, Muhammad, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires. On our TV stream on Free Speech TV, I was just reading an excerpt from that book. It's brilliant. And Professor Cole, welcome back to the program.
Thanks so much, Tom.
It's always great talking with you. I always learn something. Juan Cole, JuanCole.com is the website. And of course, you also write for The Nation. Let me start with your book. I want to talk to you about Mohammed bin Salman, and what's going on, and Khashoggi, and all this kind of stuff. I got several questions, but I, as a fellow author, I want to be sure to highlight it. Just putting Mohammed in the context of the times of these regional battles that were going on that I was largely unaware of was for me just an amazing revelation. Please describe what you learned in your research and you're conveying in this book.
The Roman Empire had switched its capital to Constantinople and was being ruled from the east and largely in Greek by the late 500s, early 600s. And it had as its direct neighbor the Sasanian Empire of Iran, which ruled both Iran and what is now Iraq. And in 603, the Iranians invaded, and by 614 they had taken Jerusalem. So if the geopolitics sounds eerily familiar, the fears about the Iranian encroachment on Jerusalem are still there with us. It just shows how things don't change that much in the Middle East.
Well, and this was the politically unstable and militarily unstable environment out of which Muhammad emerged.
That's right. These two empires fought this vicious, brutal war, which I call a world war because it was fought in Egypt and the Balkans and Central Asia. And they exhausted themselves over 25 years. They destroyed cities, they moved around populations, and Muhammad was preaching while this was going on all around him, and I argue that if you read the Quran in this context, it's a consistent call for an end to hostilities and for peace.
Yeah, he literally was the prophet of peace. And now the Saudis claim to be the main heirs to or holders of the Holy Kingdom of Medina and Mecca, the two holy cities, and the place where you've got to go to do the Hajj, and basically put forward that their version of Wahhabist Sunni Islam is the only one that is of any credibility, and they've gone to war against or want to go to war against. Well, actually, in Yemen, have gone to war against Shia. A, did I just describe that accurately? And B, how does that influence or what does that mean for the inability of Saudi Arabia to genuinely modernize?
Yeah.
And how does that play into? I mean, Khashoggi was basically calling for modernization. His last piece was published in the Washington Post today, calling for a free press in the Arab world.
Yeah. Well, the situation in Saudi Arabia does have historical roots. It goes back to the 18th century when the Al Saud, the ruling dynasty now, was a smaller power then, and they made an alliance with a hardline fundamentalist preacher, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, and he and his followers have ever since been supporters of the monarchy. So you don't have a strong separation or any separation of religion and state in Saudi Arabia. The monarchy is very closely tied to these Wahhabi clerics who preach this puritanical form of Islam, which is very peculiar. I mean, it's unlike the way Islam is practiced in Indonesia or Egypt, or there are 1.5 billion Muslims, there are 22 million Saudis. So it's off in its own corner. But inside Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabi branch is extremely powerful. And there's always been a kind of back and forth between the power of the kings and the power of the Wahhabi clergy. And what's happened is that this new crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, is moving more towards a kind of medieval European idea of absolute monarchy as not constrained even by the church. And as
he's pulling a Henry VIII?
Yes, exactly. I mean, he's cracking down on the power of the Wahhabi establishment. They would bother people, you know, if a boy and a girl went to a cafe together in public. That's not allowed because they have gender
They would come around and they'd just run up and start whipping them or screaming at them or dragging them off. Yeah. And he's put an end to that, or he's slowed that down?
He told those people to go home. So
that seems like a good thing. How do we end up with a guy who's killing an American resident journalist?
Well, see, it's sort of like to make a historical analogy, we've gone towards Thomas Hobbes and Leviathan. You know, Hobbes argued for absolute monarchy and for its power even over the religious sphere. And then John Milton wrote the Areopagitica about how the state shouldn't be interfering with people's freedom of conscience or censoring people. And from a Puritan point of view, he was writing. So I think what's going on here is if you put all your eggs, all your power, all your prerogatives in the hands of an absolute monarch where there's no check and balance, then that might be a form of, you know, forced top-down modernization, but it's not going to produce stability, and it's certainly not going to produce any liberties.
Yeah. It's remarkable. So it seems that essentially structurally it's going to be a long, long time, if ever, before the Saudis start practicing a form of Islam that is more tolerant, or for that matter, even have a political structure in place that resembles anything other than an absolute medieval monarchy.
Yeah, you know, the Saudis had been a kind of an oligarchy. There were 7 branches of the ruling family that alternated in producing a king, and they kind of consulted with each other. And what Mohammed bin Salman did was to get rid of that oligarchy, to make a coup against it, and then to substitute his and his father's power solely for it.
Right.
And while, you know, some of the things they want to do need to be done, he recognizes that oil, you know, is over with soon because everybody will go to electric cars and renewables, and it's bad for the earth. And so he has this vision 2030 to transform the Saudi economy.
Right, which got Thomas Friedman just bubbling about how wonderful he was, and Jared Kushner hanging out with him. So if our law, and I believe that I'm right on this, that the United States law, and I'm not even sure if this was part of the Magnitsky Act or if this long precedes it, because often these two things are conflated in the public dialogue or at the news dialogue. But if our law requires the United States government, if it comes into knowledge that an American person, which includes people who have green cards like Khashoggi, a permanent resident, legal permanent resident in the United States, that an American person is under threat from a foreign government, we have what's called a duty to warn. It is the government's obligation to alert that person. And so if our government had information that MBS was going after Khashoggi and failed to warn him, is the Trump administration liable? I mean, is there liability here? Was that duty to warn there? Is it probable that the administration knew what was happening in advance?
Well, we learned even in the Obama era that they were listening in on Angela Merkel's personal cell phone. So it would be very surprising if they were able to plan and pull this murder off in the Istanbul consulate of Saudi Arabia without our national security agency having overheard them planning it.
Right.
And there's, you know, some leaks to the press suggesting that this is true. I don't have firm evidence for it. I think there is an obligation to warn, and in the law, but I mean, obviously there's a moral obligation. This was a columnist for the Washington Post. He wasn't an unknown quantity.
Right.
But we don't know. Did the NSA pass this to Trump and did he sit on it, or exactly what happened? And frankly, our government in Washington is at the moment so erratic and chaotic and people resigning all the time, and then the president himself seems to have a very short attention span to be all over the place. So was this duty to warn not fulfilled because of a snafu, or was it was the U.S. government all right with the plans? We just don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, but presumably this will emerge. What is your? We just have a minute here until we're going to hit a hard break, Juan. What is your assessment of where this is going to go? Where the future? What's the future of U.S.-Saudi relations?
Well, the Trump administration will try to bury this thing and go back to business as usual after a decent interval. If the Democrats take Congress, either House or both, then you could see congressional politics around it. Back in the early 80s, the Democrats forbade the Reagan administration to spend money on supporting the Contras in Nicaragua.
But he just ignored them.
Well, he
famously broke the law.
Arabia and got and sold arms to Iran to create a black slush fund so he could continue, but he couldn't use U.S. government funds. And so Congress would be capable of placing sanctions on Saudi Arabia, including the Global Magnitsky Act, which could be invoked, at will by Congress, were they to feel that Mohammed bin Salman had been involved in this murder. So I think, on the congressional side, the relationship with Saudi Arabia could turn rocky. The signals are that Trump is not going to let this stand in his way.
Yeah. So a lot's probably going to depend on whether or not the Democrats take the House and start investigating this stuff, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Professor Juan Cole, his website, juancole.com, and you can tweet him at do I have this right? IRI Cole?
It's JRI Cole is my...
JRI, my apologies. Yeah, at JRI Cole. Professor Cole, thanks so much for dropping by today.